Hello and welcome back. It is my tremendous pleasure to introduce to you today our keynote speaker, Cory Doctorow. Cory is an author of fiction and nonfiction, and strangely enough, a lot of his fiction ends up becoming nonfiction a couple years later. And it's not because he has a crystal ball or anything, but just because he's a fantastically good observer of our present situation and a clever and deep thinker about what could be happening in years T+2, T+5. And so with that in mind, I would like you to listen carefully to what Cory has to say about the state of the internet and how we can save it. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming to the Hackaday SuperCon stage, author extraordinaire Cory Doctorow. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Hi, nice to see you. Good morning. So I've been involved in tech policy now for more than 20 years, working with the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and it has aged me. I'm now officially old. I am 52. And those of you who are officially old know that when you turn 50, the AARP doxes you and sends you a card. Now, if you know about the special extra offer, you can get the extra card that entitles you to say that when you were younger, things were better. And I got that card. So I'm here to tell you, old as dirt, 2 artificial hips, cataracts in both eyes, the internet used to be better. It used to be better back before it turned into what Tom Eastman calls 5 giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 4. And I miss that old, good internet, but I'm not here to give you a talk about how we bring back the old, good internet. I want to talk about what a new, good internet could be and why we don't have that new, good internet now and what it's going to take for us to get a new, good internet. So this is a talk about a phenomenon I call enshittification. Enshittification is a term I coined to describe how platforms die. Now, platforms have turned out to be the endemic form of business on the internet, which would have been a surprise a couple of decades ago when this was all kicking off, because if you remember, a couple of decades ago, we were really excited about disintermediation, right? The fact that we could all talk to each other directly, transact directly, and that we would get rid of these intermediaries. Well, a platform's just an intermediary, right? On the one side, it has business customers. On the other side, it has end users. So like Uber has drivers on one side and riders on the other. Amazon and eBay have sellers on one side and buyers on the other. Google and Facebook have one side that has publishers and advertisers on it, and on the other side, it's got searchers or end users. So the platform sits between these 2 different groups, business customers and end users, as an intermediary. We said we would disintermediate the world, and we did, and then we promptly re-intermediated it with the internet's platforms. So how do platforms die? Well, first, platforms are good to their users. Then it finds a way to lock in those users so it can abuse them in order to make things better for those business customers. And then once those business customers are locked in, it finds a way to abuse those business customers to claw back all the value that was transacting between those 2 parties for itself, leaving as little on the table as possible or as is necessary to continue its operation, and then it dies. We are living through a mass end-stage form of platform decay, what I sometimes think of as the great enshittening. And I'm going to explain that 3-stage process of platform enshittification, and then I'm going to explain the policy choices that led to it, and then I'm going to tell you which policy changes would let us seize the means of computation to build a new good internet that is a worthy successor to that old good internet. This is a talk about how we make today's enshitternet a transitional phase between the old good internet that we used to have and a new good internet that we deserve. So I'll start with a little case study here. Let's talk about Facebook. Facebook is a company that was founded to allow Mark Zuckerberg and his friends to non-consensually rate the fuckability of their fellow Harvard undergraduates, and it got worse after that. When Facebook started, it was only open to US college kids and high school kids. You needed a .edu or a K-12 US address to sign up. But in 2006, it opened its doors to the general public. And it told them, yeah, I know You all use MySpace, but has it ever occurred to you that MySpace is owned by an evil, crapulent, senescent Australian billionaire who spies on you with every hour that God sends? Come to Facebook. Facebook is the privacy-forward alternative to MySpace where we will never spy on you. Come to Facebook. Tell us who matters to you. Articulate your social graph. And we will ask all of those people in your social graph what they have to say to the world. And whenever they post, we will give you a feed of all the things that the people you care about have to say. Now, that was stage one. Facebook had this surplus. It had a bunch of capital from its investors, Peter Thiel and co., and it allocated that surplus to those end users. Those end users then proceeded to lock themselves into Facebook. There are lots of strategies for locking people to a platform, exclusive arrangements, driving your competitors out of business, DRM, and so on. But with social media, you don't need any of that stuff. People lock themselves in through something that economists call the collective action problem. Once you and all your friends are on Facebook, it's really hard for you to leave because you want to be with them and they want to be with you. You join Facebook to hang out with your friends join Facebook to hang out with you, and now leaving becomes a transcendently hard problem because it's not just convincing all your friends to go, although that's hard. I mean, when this day is over and you and half a dozen people you know at the con try to agree on going out for a drink, you may agree that it's time to go out for a drink, but you could argue all night about where to go for that drink. Multiply that by a couple hundred friends who are on Facebook because it's where their kids' Little League games carpools are being organized, or where their customers are, or where there's a support group for their rare disease. And getting everyone to agree that it's time to go, much less where they should go, becomes a transcendently hard problem. So Facebook doesn't just have high network effects, right? That's when people sign up because other people have signed up and the platform gets more valuable the more people who use it. They have high switching costs. Leaving Facebook means leaving behind all of your friends. Once those end users have locked themselves to Facebook's platform, it's time for Facebook to enter phase two. They withdraw the surplus from those end users and they start giving it to these two different groups of business customers. There's really three if you include app developers, but this example could go on all day if I did that. So let's talk about publishers and advertisers. So first, Facebook turns to the publishers and they say, do you remember when we told these rubes that we weren't going to spy on them? That was a lie. We spy on them from asshole to appetite. And if you give us just a tiny amount of money, we will target your ads precisely to people who meet your characteristics. Those ads will be dirt cheap to serve, and we have a building full of engineers that are going to do nothing but fight ad fraud. So when you give us $1 to show someone an ad, the person you want that ad to see will see that ad. And then they went to the publishers, and they said, hey, do you remember when we told these rubes that we were only going to show them the things that they asked to see? Also a lie. If you upload tiny excerpts of the things that you want other people to see, along with a link back to your website, we will non-consensually cram it into the eyeballs of people who never asked to see it. You will get a free traffic funnel back to your website that you can monetize in any way you can see fit. So here we have the users taking each other hostage, and then the fact that the users are all held hostage makes hostages of the publishers and the advertisers. And once the publishers and the advertisers are locked in and the users are locked in and everyone is holding everyone else hostage, it's time for stage 3 enshittification, the withdrawal of surplus from those business customers as well as those end users to deliver that surplus to the shareholders of the company. Now, digital has this great characteristic to it, which is that it has infinite gradations. It is very fluid and flexible. You can change the business logic of a digital platform from moment to moment and second to second, and that turns out to be enormously valuable for this final stage. So for the advertisers, the way that the surplus gets withdrawn is that the price of ads starts to creep up. It doesn't go up in one big whack, and it doesn't go up all the time. It goes up differentially across different kinds of ad products, and it's very hard to know whether the price is going up or whether the ads are less effective. And the ads do get less effective because they draw down policing for ad fraud, to the point where eventually Procter & Gamble canceled its $100 million a year programmatic ad spend and saw a $0 drop in sales because most of those ads were like being shown below the fold on Windows, or artificial clicks being fired off by apps that no one was looking at. And it was just, Facebook didn't care. They didn't have to care. This is the old Lily Tomlin joke where she used to pretend to be a telephone operator and do these ads for AT&T, and she would end each one with, "We don't care, we don't have to care, we're the phone company," right? Once Facebook has the advertisers locked in, they don't care, they don't have to care. They're the place where you have to run your ads. So for the advertisers, the prices go up, the quality of the ad delivery goes down. For the publishers, you also have this incredible flexibility. You can turn the dial to reduce the reach of publishers' material unless they post longer and longer excerpts that are more and more substitutive for the stuff that they have back on their own website. Now, if a publisher balks and walks away from it, you can give them a bunch more traffic briefly and make them think, oh, I guess Facebook is a place where people who like our stuff congregate. Look at all the traffic we're getting. We'll go back, and then you can try and play them again. This isn't, the dopamine hacking mind control that we hear so much about in this kind of self-aggrandizing way when tech bros who've gotten sad about the things that they did to make their millions repent. This is just like playing a fish on a line. It's being able to alter the business logic from moment to moment and second to second in a highly automated fashion. And so the publishers put more and more of their content on Facebook until they're fully substitutive. And then Facebook can really turn the screws, oh, if there's a link back to your website, we're not going to show your stuff. We're not going to boost it to people who didn't ask to see it. We're not even going to show it to your subscribers because maybe that link is a malicious link. Oh, and also, even if you don't put the link in, you're going to have to pay to boost it. Otherwise, it's not going to show up in the feed of people who asked to see it. Right? So this is the commodification of publishers, the exploitation of advertisers, the bad deal for end users. And whenever anyone complains, the Facebook executives who hear those complaints quote the most important lesson they learned when they took the Darth Vader MBA, which is, "I have altered the deal. Pray I don't alter it further." So they're withdrawing all of this available surplus and giving it to their shareholders. And the goal, the equilibrium they're seeking, is an equilibrium in which the barest amount of value needed to keep locking people to the platform and then business customers locked to those people is residually left behind, and then everything else is delivered to their investors, right? It's extracted from them. And the problem with that equilibrium is it's super brittle, right? Because the difference between I hate this place, but I can't bring myself to give it up, and oh my God, why am I still using this place? I am out of here. It's like one privacy scandal, one whistleblower complaint, one live stream mass shooting, and then everyone bolts for the exits. And when that happens, right, when you start to get disappointing numbers and reduced numbers and your earnings calls don't go so well, then the platforms enter the final stage of enshittification, which is panicking, but they have a nice name for it. They call it pivoting. And the Facebook pivot looks like this. I know I told you that from now on, all of your relationships will be commodified by me. It's impossible to have friends without being spied on by Mark Zuckerberg. I've changed my mind. I think that there's a new future for you. I think that you should be transformed to a legless, sexless, low-polygon cartoon character in a heavily surveilled virtual world we stole from a 25-year-old cyberpunk novel, right? Now, enshittification is not inevitable. This didn't have to happen. There are lots of platforms that just went belly up without first destroying a bunch of people's lives on the way. But when three criteria are satisfied, enshittification always ensues. Now, the first criterion is a general lack of competition, and that's an environment we live in across the board. Now, 40 years ago, Jimmy Carter started to pull some Jenga blocks out of the antitrust enforcement environment. Then Reagan got elected, and he started to tear them out by the fistful. And every administration since has drawn down antitrust enforcement, nerfing it, making it weaker. And so every industry, not just tech, is dominated by a tiny handful of companies. Wherever you look, it looks like tech. Pharma, health insurance, appliances, athletic shoes, books, booze, drugstores, office supplies, eyeglasses. One company makes all the vitamin C. One company makes all the bottle caps. Airlines, railroads, rental cars, mattresses, champagne, candy, and professional wrestling, right? You name it, the sector has gone from dozens or hundreds of firms to 4, 3, 2, or 1. Now, these companies grew by doing things that used to be illegal until we started to nerf antitrust. It was illegal until the 1980s, which not coincidentally, that's the era of the PC. PCs, the internet, and the drawdown of competition law are simultaneous phenomena. Tech is the first industry in more than a century that came to maturity without being disciplined by competition law. Now, what laws were these companies allowed to violate in order to grow? Well, one thing is they were allowed to sell goods below cost, which let the deepest pocketed firms drive competitors out of the industry, right? So long as the capital markets were willing to continue to subsidize things, Uber lost 41 cents on the dollar. For 13 years, they spent $31 billion, mostly Saudi royal money, to drive all the taxi firms and all the public transit systems out of business. Today, an Uber costs twice as much as a taxi used to, and the driver gets paid half as much as they used to, right? So this allowed them to prevent new companies from entering the market. So Amazon did this, right? Amazon tried to buy a company called Diapers.com. I don't have to explain what they did. Diapers.com said they didn't want to sell to Amazon. So Amazon lit $100 million on fire over the next 3 months selling diapers below cost until Diapers.com was bankrupt. Amazon bought them for pennies on the dollar and shut them down. But in addition to this predatory pricing, and more than anything else, they were able to merge with their major competitors and buy out their smaller ones. And so everywhere we look, we see tech companies whose growth strategy was driven not by making great things, but by buying other people's great stuff. I mean, think about Google, right? If you remember 25 years ago, Google's search engine was a revelation, right? Compared to Ask Jeeves, Yahoo, AltaVista, it was the most amazing product we'd ever seen for organizing the world's information, as their motto has it, right? And so we all used that search engine. It was great. It opened a spigot to the capital markets that allowed Google to go on a buying spree. And in the years since, almost without exception, every product that Google has tried to make internally was a failure, right? Their video platform, their Wi-Fi balloons, all those social media plays, even their RSS reader crashed and burned, right? Meanwhile, Google grew by buying other people's ideas. So their whole ad tech stack, their whole mobile stack, server management, docs, collaboration, maps, you name it, it's someone else's idea, which they bought and operationalized very well. But operationalization, speaking as a former ops guy, is not innovation. There is a difference between coming up with something new and making something that someone else made run well. And it's not like that doesn't matter, but if we're talking about this company as Willy Wonka's idea factory, we're wrong, right? They're rich Uncle Pennybags with a host of extremely skilled janitors who keep other people's ideas running and scale them up. So it's not Google. It's not just Google. Apple buys 90 companies a year, right? Tim Cook brings home a new company for his shareholders more often than you bring home a bag of groceries for your family. Now, eliminating competition is the key to enshittification. It's a lot easier to treat your customers like shit when there's nowhere else they can go. We're the phone company. We don't care. We don't have to care. But all industries consolidated, not just tech, and enshittification happens when two tech-specific factors are folded into the mix. So I'll do a little quick computer science interlude here. This is a technical conference. Do you remember when we talked about how network effects drive this explosive growth? You join a service because your friends are there, then your friends join because you're there. You make an app because there's users on a platform. Other people join the platform because there's apps there for them. Someone else makes apps and so on. So network effects are intrinsic to tech. But tech has another property, an irreducible feature that operates as the anti-network effect, which is the intrinsic low switching costs of technology driven by its universality, driven by the fact that the only computer we know how to make and operationalize is the Turing-complete universal von Neumann machine that'll run every program that we know how to write, which means that every software-driven product or service is liable to being challenged by adversarially interoperable products, things made unilaterally by hackers who reverse engineer, scrape, and use bots to plug something into them that allows users or other parties to the platform to get more value out of them than the shareholders intended. Do you remember the Facebook case study? When Facebook was telling MySpace users that they should leave behind Rupert Murdoch's surveillance dystopia for Facebook, their pitch wasn't, come to Facebook and admire our superior privacy policy while you wait for your friends to get wise and join you. They gave you a bot. And you gave the bot your login credentials for MySpace. And it went to MySpace on a periodic basis, logged in as you, checked your inbox for waiting messages, checked your feed for waiting elements, reposted them to your Facebook context, allowed you to reply to them, and autopiloted them back to MySpace. You didn't have to choose between the people that mattered to you on Facebook and the policies you preferred or rather the people that mattered to you on MySpace and the policies you preferred on Facebook. It wasn't a pre-feast menu. It was a la carte. You could have the friends on MySpace and the policies on Facebook, and you could choose one and the other and merge them together. So if you tried to do that to Facebook today, they would reduce you to radioactive rubble. The explosive growth that platforms get from network effects attracts competitors. And those competitors hack interop layers into their products that attack their highest margin offerings, draining off users and revenues, so that every company that begins with this network effects-driven explosive growth always ends with implosive contraction driven by low switching costs. Every successful tech giant today has an adversarial interoperability story in its history. Google presented itself to every web server in the world and said, "Hi, I'm a user, enumerate your documents for me." Apple reverse engineered Microsoft Office and the iWork suite and made the iWork suite, Pages, Numbers, and Keynote, that could perfectly read and write Word, Excel, and PowerPoint files. Look hard at any tech company, and you'll find in their history that there was a moment where they were ripping, mixing, and burning the biggest products and services of the day. And of course, they went after those biggest platforms. They went after them for the same reason that Willie Sutton robbed banks, because that's where the money was. But when these companies exploited our dying antitrust rules to grow to unimaginable scale, they were able to join forces and declare the end of history. They were able to say, well, adversarial interoperability, reverse engineering, hacking, bots, scraping, all that great guerrilla warfare stuff we're here to do today, that was fine when we did it. It was necessary to humanity's progress, but when you do it to us, it's a crime. Because every pirate wants to be an admiral. An industry with 1,000 small and medium-sized companies, they have the same collective action problem that you and your friends are going to have at the end of the day when you try to figure out where to go for a drink. They can't agree on anything. Not only can't they agree on what law there should be, they can't agree on who to hire to cater a meeting where they would discuss what the law should be. If you're officially old, you may remember the Napster Wars. Now, during the Napster Wars in the early 2000s, tech was an order of magnitude and more larger than the entertainment sector that were their adversaries in these policy forums, but big content kicked small tech's ass, because there were 5 labels and 7 studios, which meant that they could easily agree on a single unified response to peer-to-peer file sharing, and they could bring that to all of the policy forums where these debates were being had. Now, today, there's 3 labels and 4 studios, and these companies have grown so incestuous, they have the corporate equivalent of a Habsburg jaw, which is how they end up with these bizarre dicta like all creative workers are going to be replaced by chatbots, which is why, of course, just down the road in my neighborhood in Burbank, we've had first the writers and now the actors on the picket line. When a sector only has 5 companies or 4 or 3 or 2 or just 1, it can agree on a policy direction, and it can screw its customers and its suppliers so hard that it amasses the fortune that it needs to buy that policy. And today, tech is even more concentrated than entertainment was back in the copyright wars. And they've agreed on the end of history. When Apple reversed Office and built iWork, Microsoft had to suck it up. But in the ensuing decades, Apple and Microsoft and Facebook and Google and all those other tech giants have secured changes to law, regulation, and the interpretations of both that make doing unto them as they did unto the people who came before them radioactively illegal. Try to reverse engineer the file formats used by iOS and make a runtime and player for iOS apps and the media that you buy from Apple's media stores, and they will bomb you till the rubble bounces. They will come after you with Section 1201 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. They'll call you a tortious interferer with their contracts. They'll say you violated their patents, their copyrights, their trademarks, and their trade secrets. Now, in these circles, I know the term IP is a kind of red rag to a certain kind of bull, right? Should we call it IP? What do we mean by that? Is it even property? It doesn't have any meaning. What are you talking about when you say IP? But in business circles, IP has a single, universally understood, crisply defined meaning. IP is any rule, policy, or law that I can invoke to reach beyond the four walls of my firm to exert control over the conduct of my customers, my critics, and my competitors. Or as Jay Freeman, who ran the late lamented Cydia project, says, IP is anything that lets you conjure up felony contempt of business model. So here's how that works today. 1 in 4 web users has installed an ad blocker. It's the largest consumer boycott in human history, to quote Doc Searles. Right? 0 in 4 app users have installed an ad blocker. And the reason for that is reverse engineering the app in order to add the ad blocker. That first step of bypassing the DRM on the app is a felony under Section 1201 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, carrying a $500,000 fine and a 5-year prison sentence. Seen in that light, all an app is a web page that you wrap in just enough IP to make it a crime to use the app in a way that benefits the user at the expense of the manufacturer. So back to enshittification. Enshittification is what happens when companies don't have competition and when they're able to use the incredible flexibility of digital computers to twiddle the knobs on the back end, to do the Darth Vader, to alter the deal further, unconstrained by enforcement of privacy law, labor law, or consumer protection law, turning every platform into a rigged Skinner box casino where the payout schedule is altered from moment to moment in such a way that it's impossible for end users or business customers to figure out whether or how to get a fair deal. Tech companies can twiddle those knobs on the back end whenever they want, without any explanation for it, without even telling us they're doing it. And we can't get a law passed to make them stop compulsively touching their knobs, because in a world of 5 giant websites, each filled with screenshots of text from the other 4, they can easily agree that those rules would be unfair and bad. And they can mobilize their monopoly casino winnings to make sure that those laws never come to pass. So let's do a little recap here. Step 1, consolidated industries eliminate competition through predatory pricing and acquisitions. Step 2, tech companies play this high-speed shell game on the back end, and they use their consolidation to Bigfoot any attempt to constrain that twiddling, like privacy, labor, or fair trading laws. And now we come to the final step, step 3, and this is where tech companies embrace tech law, the laws that make it illegal to twiddle back at them, to do what you folks are doing here, to be hackaday hackers. The IP laws that create the felony contempt of business model, that criminalize adversarial interoperability, the processes that once act as the great garbage collector for enshittified, bloated, top-heavy companies, allowing nimble, innovative players to drain off their users, eat their lunch, and dance on their graves. When you put those 3 factors together, consolidation, unrestricted twiddling for them, and a total ban on twiddling for us, that's when enshittification becomes inevitable. That's how enshittification works. Now let's talk about how we're going to stop it, throw it into reverse, build a new good internet that is a worthy successor to the old good internet. So step 1, we have to halt consolidation and start breaking up these big tech silos. And this one is actually going great. After 40 years, we have the first US administration in 2 generations that takes this seriously, that wants to make antitrust stronger, not weaker. And it's not an America-only phenomenon. They are joined by colleagues in the UK, in the EU, in Canada, and Australia, even in China, where the Chinese cyberspace regulation prohibits blocking interoperability by big Chinese tech companies. And they are blocking mergers, and they're demanding breakups. And this fight has been joined by lawmakers from across the political spectrum. When I say this is bipartisan, I'm not kidding here. There's an act in the Senate called the America Act. And it is a weird quirk. Speaking as a Canadian, I am Canadian. We're like serial killers. We're everywhere. We look just like everyone else. Speaking as a Canadian, I do find it weird that America's top political science graduates go on to an apprenticeship of 3 to 5 years in the Congress or the Senate where their main job is thinking up cool acronyms for bills. So there's this bill called the America Act, and I assume it stands for something like A is for America, the country that I love. M is for motherhood, the value that we love. Whatever it stands for, the America Act will break up the 2 big tech ad silos, Meta and Google, force them to sell off those ad tech units and splinter them into separate units. And when I call this a bipartisan bill, what I mean is that its two main sponsors are Elizabeth Warren and Ted Cruz, right? That is a pretty bipartisan piece of regulation. Now, this year, the Federal Trade Commission and the DOJ published new merger guidelines, which ban the anti-competitive mergers that have been the norm for 40 years. And if you're only cursorily paying attention to this, you might have gotten the impression that the chair of the FTC, Lina Khan, is thrashing indiscriminately at big tech mergers like Activision Microsoft, only to lose in court. There have been 80 editorials to that effect in the Wall Street Journal. They are not neutral parties in the fight against monopoly. But the reality is that Lina Khan is setting out to make a new law after 4 decades of complacency and bias in favor of monopolies, taking big swings that no one has taken since the Carter administration, which makes her a goddamn American hero, and she's going to miss some of those big swings because she's taken them. She is joined by colleagues like Rohit Chopra at the CFPB, who just this week promulgated an interoperability mandate for finance information so you can leave your bank and take all your data with you, including your payees and everything else that you need to go to a comparison shopping site and find out which bank will give you a better deal, and then get set up with all of your history, all of your payees, and everything else you need on another bank with one click, like keeping your phone number when you change phone companies. And Jonathan Cantor at the DOJ, who's hauled Google into court for the first time after decades and decades of anti-competitive growth. But those breakups, those enforcement actions, they're going to take a long-ass time. It took 69 years to break up AT&T from the first action the DOJ took until they were finally broken up in 1982. And I don't want to wait that long for a new good internet, and we don't have to wait that long, because tech is different. It is universal. It is interoperable. And that means that we have options that we can reach for in policy forums that we've never had before. Interoperability options. Options that devolve control over technology from giant companies to small companies, to co-ops, to nonprofits, to tinkerers, to communities of users themselves. Interop is how we seize the means of computation. So first things first, we need to limit twiddling. We need to pass comprehensive federal privacy laws with private rights of action, meaning that you yourself can bring a suit against a company that violates your privacy, even if your state attorney general or local prosecutor doesn't think it's worth getting you justice. We need to end worker misclassification through the so-called gig economy, meaning that every worker should be entitled to minimum wages, a safe workplace, and fair scheduling. And we need to apply normal consumer protection laws to e-commerce platforms so that if you search for a part by its number, that should be the first result you get, not 6 pages of sponsored results from companies that make look-alike parts that aren't the thing that you're looking for, but which pay the company. Amazon makes $31 billion on this payola ad market. We need to open up those walled gardens. In the European Union, they've passed the Digital Markets Act. It comes into effect this year, and it orders all the major platforms to stand up APIs that allow new firms to plug into them and exchange data with them, and where our privacy and other rights are protected not by the company deciding who can interoperate and who can't, but by region-wide European privacy, consumer protection, and labor laws. So we're not asking Facebook, hey, is this company good or bad for your privacy? I don't trust Facebook's answer to that for reasons that I hope are obvious to all of us. This interop will make switching costs low, so you can leave Facebook or Twitter and go to Mastodon or Diaspora or Blue Sky or some other platform and still exchange messages with the people you leave behind, participate in the communities that matter to you, and connect with the customers that you rely on. These new platforms, they need to be constrained as to how they fiddle with their knobs the way the big ones should be, subject to privacy, fair trading, and labor laws. But there is a fatal flaw in a plan to open up interoperability with mandatory APIs, which is that they're very easy to cheat on. Because just because we order Facebook to open up an API and allow third parties to connect to it, it doesn't mean that we don't want them to have an emergency brake, an intrusion detection system, a firewall that checks to see, is someone exploiting a vuln in that API to exfiltrate 1 billion users' data? And if so, hit the big red button that shuts down the API until you can figure out whether it's right or wrong. And that means that Facebook can cheat. They can claim that they pulled the plug on the API because they thought there was a breach, when really they just wanted to destabilize those new platforms that were starting to eat their lunch, to teach their founders, their users, and their investors that you can't bet against Facebook and win. So maybe we have to drag Facebook in front of a regulator to get them punished for this, but that's going to take years because to a first approximation, everybody who understands Facebook's infra is a Facebook engineer. So we're going to have to depose these people to determine whether it's a bona fide shutdown or a pretextual one. And by the time these years-long fact-intensive disputes have been resolved, all those new market entrants have left the market, leaving nothing behind. So to make mandatory APIs work, we need to make robust interoperability preferable to screwing around behind the scenes to break APIs. We need to align those tech giants' incentives so that they encourage competition rather than sabotaging it. And this is where hackers like you come in. This is what we need the technical community for. Because in addition to the mandatory interop that's already in the pike, we need to restore the right to mod, to tinker, to reverse, and to hack. I'm going to tell you why, I'm going to tell you how, and I'm going to tell you how we make it safe for users. First, why? Well, companies hate competition. No one hates capitalism more than a capitalist, but they hate surprises even more. If we have the right to mod existing services to restore busted or degraded API functionality, then a company that's tempted to break or degrade its API has to consider the possibility that all of you are going to show up and scrape its servers or reverse its apps and make the API work again. And that means that the choice for those giants is not keep the API and lose my discontented users, or nerf the API and screw my competitors. It becomes keep the API and lose my discontented users, or nerf the API and get embroiled in unquantifiable risk from guerrilla warfare with all of you, against engineers who have the attacker's advantage, meaning I have to be perfect and make no mistakes, and they only have to find one mistake that I've made and exploit it. Now, tech giants hate surprises more than they hate competition because investors really hate surprises. When you get a quarterly earnings call and announce worse results than you predicted, your investors go crazy and your share price tanks. If you remember at the end of the first quarter of 2022, Facebook had an investor call where they announced that not that they'd lost users, but that their users had grown less quickly than they had told their investors to expect at the end of the last quarter. It prompted the largest one-day sell-off in world corporate history. $250 billion came off of Facebook's market cap in a single day. Now, the decision, if it comes for an executive, Facebook to cheat on an API and degrade it or block it, that's going to come from an executive. And that executive is going to be sitting on a mountain of Facebook shares because the people whose portfolios are most top-heavy with a company's shares are its own executives, because these companies don't have to pay their top personnel with money. They can pay them with shares. Money they get through hard graft. Shares they get by typing zeros into a spreadsheet. So they preferentially pay their top executives with shares. So those individuals, the individuals in the position to make the decision to break the API, those individuals are the individuals who stand to lose the most personally if they do it. Now, no one ever lost money betting on the hubris of tech executives. So maybe they'll go ahead and do it anyway. And if they do, well, we've got scraping, we've got bots, we've got reverse engineering, we've got adversarial interoperability, we've got all of you to bring all that stuff back and keep the API functioning. So how do we get adversarial interoperability back in the law? Well, we need to roll back all of those laws that constitute felony contempt of business model. The anti-circumvention laws, the criminalization of terms of service violations, overbroad patents and copyright, all of that. But that is a project of years, and we need action now. So here's one way we can do that. First, we could just wait for these tech companies to cheat on the mandates that are coming down the pike. They're gonna cheat. They're constitutionally incapable of not cheating. And when they do, we can penalize them. One of the penalties available to regulators when companies violate regulations is oversight by a special master, right? This is a lawyer who acts as kind of adult supervision. And that special master would be charged with reviewing every legal threat that the company wants to send to a little interoperator to figure out whether it's something that is protecting the bona fide interests of those users, like the company is Cambridge Analytica and they're scraping and they want to stop them from doing it, or whether it's just about protecting the shareholders, in which case the special master can say, no, I'm sorry, that legal action is not available to you. Now, while we're waiting for these companies to cheat, we can mobilize the government for us, specifically government procurement. Governments could and should require that every tech company that sells them a product or a service has to covenant, to promise, not to interfere with interoperability, not to sue the vendors the government hires to maintain or improve the things that it's bought on our behalf. Now, that is just prudent public administration. It's got a long history in this country. Lincoln only bought rifles for the Union Army if they came from armorers that used standard tooling and ammo, because it would be embarrassing to be the commander-in-chief of a country at war and to show up on Gettysburg and say, sorry, boys, battle's canceled. Our sole supplier is not making ammunition this week. Right? It's just good, prudent administration. Every digital system procured by every level of government should come with a binding covenant not to impede interoperability. From cars and government motor pools to Google Classroom in our public schools to iPhones in our public agencies. And the companies that supply these right now are going to complain like crazy, but no one forces a tech company to do business with the federal government. If you are too emotionally fragile to sell to the American public on reasonable terms, you should find another line of work more in keeping with your delicate sensibilities. Your shareholders' priorities are your problem, but the public agency's business is our business, and their problem is making sure we get good value for money. Okay, so we use adversarial interop to keep big companies from sabotaging mandatory interop, and we use procurements, conduct remedies, and new law to get that adversarial interop. And how will we keep the interoperators honest? After all, if you squint just right, as I said, Cambridge Analytica is an interoperator. Remember when I talked about putting limits on twiddling? The need for a privacy law, labor law, fair trading laws? That's how we do it. It is frankly surreal that the way we keep Facebook's partners from abusing you is by asking Facebook to make the final determination about whether a tool you want to use to interface with Facebook is good or bad for you. Remember, Cambridge Analytica was one of Facebook's partners. So whether you're using an API or you're fielding an interoperable app that relies on scraping and reversing, you should be bound by those same laws passed by democratically accountable lawmakers in public proceedings, not by shareholder-accountable corporate executives in closed-door meetings. Now, enshittification did not happen because today's companies are run by evil geniuses. They're no more wicked than the people who founded DEC or Sun or AOL. All of those companies had executives in them that would have abolished competition if they could have. They would have captured their regulators. They would have abused their users and their business customers if they could have gotten away with it. But we did not let them get away with it. We let the current crop get away with murder. They're able to buy their way to dominance, merging with their competitors until they have the money and the unity of purpose to capture our laws, and that gives them the freedom to abuse us without limit and to criminalize anything we do in our own self-defense. To stop them, we need to block new mergers, unwind existing ones, limit their ability to twiddle the back end to keep their users and business customers in a constant state of confusion, and restore our ability to twiddle back, to give ourselves an internet operated by and for the people who use it. A new, good internet that is a worthy successor to the old, good internet. Now, some of you will have traveled from away to California. Welcome. I'm a Californian for the 5th time now. I've lived here for 7 years. I became a US citizen last year. If you've come to California, you might have been warned that sometimes we're on fire. California's on fire a lot. Now, some of that's the climate emergency, don't get me wrong. But there's another reason that California burns every year, and it's because until settler colonialists came to this place in the world, the indigenous people here used to practice controlled burns every year. They would burn part of the woods in a controlled way to consume the fuel that was piling up on the forest floor and to open up the canopy for new growth. When the settler colonialists arrived, they banned good fire. And what they got wasn't the absence of fire. What they got was fire debt that eventually turned into wildfire. Now, when tech companies had to contend with the implosive contraction of low switching costs, they were dynamic. They sprung up and they disappeared all the time. When we stopped enforcing antitrust law, we ended good fire. We accumulated fire debt, and now we have wildfires. Our tech companies have terminal gigantism, and they're on fire all the time. It's time to stop trying to make the tech giants better. It's time to start evacuating them so that they can burn. In your heart, you know that we could have a better internet than this one and a better tech industry too. Remember when tech workers used to dream of going to work for a big dumb company for 3 years before quitting and starting another company that knocked their old employer over? And then the dream shrank, and it became work for a big dumb company for 3 years, do a fake startup that gets acqui-hired by your old company as the world's least efficient way to get a promotion and a bonus. And then the dream shrank again to, well, work for this company for the rest of my life, get a good salary, there's free kombucha in the cafeteria, and they give me massages every Wednesday. And then the dream shrank again, and now it's work for this company until they fire me and 12,000 of my colleagues the way Google did just a few months after doing a stock buyback that would have paid all of our salaries for the next 27 years. We deserve better than this, and we can get it. These are not individual problems. You can't solve this by making better individual choices. By all means, make the choices that minimize the harm that you experience. As skilled technical people, you are better situated to make those choices than most, but voting with your wallet won't solve this problem. When you vote with your wallet, you cast a ballot in a rigged election where the participants with the thickest wallets get the most ballots, and the winner is always the monopoly party. To make a difference, you need to act as a polity, not as an individual. There are technical groups all around. The ACM, if any of you are members, has its US Tech Policy Committee, which is always looking for volunteers. I'm a member of it. There are other organizations that you can join. The one I've worked with for now nearly a quarter of a century, the one that aged me and made me an old person, is the Electronic Frontier Foundation, an organization that operates all around the country and all around the world and has a network of Electronic Frontier affiliates, local groups that work on local ordinances, everything from procurement to tech policy in schools, police departments, municipalities, and so on. If you look for EFA, the Electronic Frontier Alliance, you can find a local group. And I hope that you'll consider supporting EFF as well. I am not just someone who's worked for that organization for coming up like pretty soon on half my life, but someone who donates a substantial portion of the money that I make every year back to them. It's through collective action that we make differences. So I want to finish here with a lesson from my archenemy. Everyone should have an archenemy. Mine is the loathsome Milton Friedman. He was the court sorcerer to Ronald Reagan, the architect of the neoliberal revolution, the author of our misery. These policies that we're contending with that created this monopoly and this corporate impunity, they came from him. And he was a monster, but he knew a thing or two. People would ask him, Milton, how will you ever put your kooky fringe ideas into operation? People like living in the post-war prosperity. They don't want to go back to being forelock-tugging plebs whose kids can't go to university, who don't get a retirement, who aren't entitled to health benefits, who, if they lose their job, don't get unemployment benefits. And Friedman would say, someday there will come a crisis. And when the crisis comes, the ideas lying around can move from the fringe to the center in an instant. Our job is to maintain ideas lying around until the impossible becomes the inevitable. And I love quoting Friedman. Satan took him to hell in 2006. I like to imagine that when I quote him and he hears his words in my mouth, he gargles a curse around that red-hot iron bar sticking out of his mouth as the demons turn the spit, and I get a warm glow from it. We are lurching from crisis to crisis, and thus far we do the same thing we did at every juncture, but harder. And we hope for a different outcome. We need to start having better ideas lying around, ideas that address themselves to the material reality of where these tech giants came, where their power comes from, and what we can do to stop it, so that the next crisis doesn't go to waste. Thank you very much. All right. So we have 15 minutes for questions. The way that it'll work is I'll call on you and then I'll repeat the question for everyone else. Question has one part, not two, and it's never more of a comment. Also, I should point out that there's a bookseller here, and my latest book, The Internet Con, explains all of this stuff in detail and goes into a lot of technical detail about these policy remedies. And also, my next novel is here. It doesn't come out for 2 weeks, so you'll be the first people in the world who will get a chance to buy a copy. My publishers made it available early. So if there's anyone who has a question, just stick your hand up. Sir. So how much would long distance be right now if AT&T wasn't broken up? This is a very good question. It's a good question for people who grew up with modems. It's interesting. When people talk about breaking up big tech, every now and again you'll get apologists for big tech who say, sure, they're abusive, they're suboptimal, but without big tech to defend us, China will take over the internet, right? Now, that's not a new argument. In 1980, when they were going after AT&T, they said, if you break up AT&T, a belligerent power in Asia that is an authoritarian state that steals our best ideas and knocks them off and is bent on destroying our electronics industry will come and take over the world's technology sphere. That country was Japan, not China, but the kind of racist nonsense is the same. It turned out that opening up the internet, opening up the telephone system, one of the main effects that it had was giving us access to modems, right? Because AT&T's major project was stopping us from building end-to-end networks, because centralized networks allow the operator of the network to capture all the value in the network, right? You remember when caller ID came about? It was like $1.99 a month to find out who was calling you before you answered the phone. Now, any one of you could probably imagine how to build a little blue box that has like a bat signal that goes off that you could give to someone else, and if it was you calling, it would detect it and blink. But you couldn't roll that out without AT&T's permission. And so AT&T got to charge you $1.99 for this service, right? In this centralized network model and a non-end-to-end, non-neutral model, you get something that I call the urinary tract infection business model, where instead of value flowing in a healthy gush, every new feature comes with a price tag attached to it and comes out in a slow, painful, burning dribble, right? So long distance was part of it, right? And obviously the price of long distance, the true price of long distance isn't what your cell carrier charges you, it's what your VoIP provider charges you, which is zero, right? That is the actual price of long distance today, it is zero. It's the same price as caller ID, right? How much extra does it cost to see who a message is from in your email inbox before you double click it? Nothing, right? Because devolving power to the edges of the network gives users of the network much more power to shop around, and it disciplines firms, right? I don't think competition solves all of our problems, but I do think that companies are disciplined by some mix of competition, regulation, and the fear that users or other stakeholders will take unilateral action to modify their services, go elsewhere, mix and match. If any of you are familiar with ad tech, header bidding, right, where they started to mix and match how they use the ad brokerages by embedding JavaScript in the headers of their pages. Those are the three things that companies fear and that cause them to respond. And when companies get large enough, they don't have to fear any of them. And so, yeah, AT&T certainly crushed us with high long distance rates, and like my origin story as a kid with an Apple II Plus in 1979 and then a Hayes compatible modem in 1981 starts with this moment, right, where we're starting to see deregulation, BBSs, all of that stuff. But everything, all of the services that connect us from edge to edge in the network, all of those owe their existence to what turned out to be a very brief moment in antitrust, right? So AT&T had been chased up and down the country for 69 years by the DOJ and the FTC. In 1982, Ronald Reagan and his advisors knew that two tech companies were basically crushing the American tech industry. One was IBM and one was AT&T. And they figured getting rid of either one of them would probably open some space for new growth. And they had to choose which one would be more ideologically palatable to their extremist backers. And they went with AT&T because they said, oh, they're a regulated monopoly, so they weren't really a company anyways. They're just an arm of government. Breaking up AT&T is effectively deregulation. And then antitrust went into a coma, and the baby bells started to buy each other and merge again. And all the big phone companies today are descendants of those baby bells that have merged into just a few giant companies. But even that brief respite, even that one tiny moment in which people like you who had a cool idea that wanted to provide someone else with an endpoint so that the two of you could talk could do that without having to take a license or get permission from a monopolist who didn't care whether the users wanted it or you wanted it, but what it did to their shareholders' interests. That brief respite gave us the 40-year internet, which not only was good for all of us, but like if you're an America First hawk who was worried about Japan eating America's lunch if we broke up AT&T, well, I don't think anyone can seriously argue that the internet was bad for American soft power around the world either, right? And I think that we can make the same argument today when we hear scare stories about Chinese tech. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. Yeah, so the question is, can we trust our regulators to regulate AI? And how do you stop the perverse downstream effects of regulation like GDPR cookie pop-ups everywhere? Well, first I'll note that as the person who first mentioned AI, you now owe everyone else a drink. I think it is possible to make good evidence-based policy. Yeah, I think that like the great barriers to making evidence-based policy come out of two things, right? One is determining the right answer, which can be hard. But the other is compiling the evidence that allows you to figure out what the right answer is. And that's very, very hard under conditions of monopoly, because you can think of regulatory rulemaking as a truth-seeking exercise, not unlike, say, peer-reviewed publishing. So the regulator says, I'm thinking about making a rule. I want to say that the structural factors that go into a reinforced joist that runs over the roof of this building should follow these following contours. What do you guys think? And people pile into the notice of proposed rulemaking with their comments on it. Now, some of them are going to say, well, you can't use a wood joist. You should use a steel joist. Now, some of those people are going to be steel companies, right, who have mixed motives here. Some people are going to say, oh, well, you should just be able to wing it. Some people are going to say it should be weaker, it should be stronger. And then they're all going to go in there and they're going to go, that guy's wrong, and that guy's wrong, and that guy's wrong. And here's the documents to prove it, right? If you had 100 telcos in America and you said we should have a net neutrality rule, 50 of them might show up and say, it's impossible to run a network that is net neutral. And the other 50 are going to show up with their server logs and say, we did it, right? When there's 5 companies in the sector, they can all agree going in what evidence they're going to give. And we see this over and over again when we have these rulemakings. So look, I think getting the policy right on AI is going to be hard intrinsically. I think that figuring out there's some really thorny questions about copyright, about labor, about privacy. I'm skeptical about some of the more outlandish claims. I don't think the plausible sentence generator is going to become sentient and turn us all into paper clips. But I do think that, like, you know, our bosses are going to buy automation systems that suck. They're going to fire our asses, and then they're going to make everybody else endure, like, the 21st century equivalent of those voice response systems that we've all dialed up and gone like 17, no, 17, no, 17, operator. And that's going to be like the next generation of, you know, psychotherapists, screenwriters, teachers, you know, like I absolutely believe that our bosses are insatiably horny for firing us and replacing us with bad automation. So there are some really important AI questions. But I think that it's the concentration in the sector that makes finding those answers hard, rather. As to like what actually happened with the GDPR, it is hard to enforce regulation. The book, the Internet Con, I talk a lot about administratability, which is like how hard it is to figure out if the rule has been broken. And that's like a really important part of this. And a lot of the early attempts at privacy laws were attempts to limit how data was used post-collection, which is really hard because you just got to go like do a colonoscopy on the server to figure out what they're doing with the data after they have it, right? They make all kinds of promises. Detecting breaches of those promises is really hard, whereas like prohibiting collection in the first place is a lot easier to identify. In the case of the GDPR, the biggest administration problem is a problem with European federalism. So it's hard to remember in America because federalism is so mature. But federalism, you know, America started off as a bunch of individual countries that did not think of themselves as Americans, that had effectively like a trade agreement among themselves about what they would and wouldn't do. And they were extremely jealous of the federal government stepping in and usurping the power of the state legislature. I mean, this still plays out, obviously. We're seeing it in the abortion debate and so on. But it was really, really a big deal then, and it's still very much a big deal in Europe, where federalism is very new. And one of the things that you get in federal arrangements is members of the federation that participate in a race to the bottom to be regulatory and corporate crime havens, right? And Europe has got a whole bunch of them, right? In the same way that, like, every time you talk to an Australian and they say, oh, I'm from Western Australia, that's the Texas of Australia. And they go, also Queensland is the Texas of Australia, and also Central Australia is the Texas of Australia. South Australia is also the Texas of Australia. Oh, and Tasmania is the Texas of Australia. Europe has got like 10 Irelands. Right? It's got Ireland, it's got Malta, it's got Luxembourg, it's got Cyprus, it's got the Netherlands, right? All these places that are racing to the bottom to see who can offer the lowest tax bills. And because companies that chase the lowest tax bills and can move from country to country are very mobile, once they're there for your low tax bills, they will say, also, we want a weak regulatory environment, or we're going to move to Malta. And so all the tech companies maintain the pretense that they are headquartered in Ireland, that all of their profits are realized in an untaxable state of grace somewhere over the Irish Sea. And the Irish data commissioner, not coincidentally, barely gets out of bed. And when he does, he doesn't even put on pants. He sits around in his underwear watching cartoons and eating breakfast cereal all day and hears about 17 major cases a year, even though that is the headquarters of all the tech companies. Germany's data commissioner here's 500 plus major cases a year, right? So this is a problem that's just like part of European federalism. One way to resolve it over long time scales, and not as quickly as I'd like, is what I talked about before in the context of an American federal privacy rule, which is the private right of action, which is the right to sue if a prosecutor won't take your case. And so that's what's happened in Europe. And Max Schrems, particularly this Austrian law student who runs a nonprofit called NOYB.eu, none of your business, .eu, has finally dragged the big tech companies into court in Austria and Germany, where they're not screwing around. And so we're finally going to see like real enforcement. All that cookie pop-up stuff, that's not compliant, right? Or if they show you a cookie pop-up, you should just be able to click on the screen and keep going, right? Like the intention, like the GDPR was passed after the old privacy reg that created all the cookie consent dialogues. The point of the GDPR was to eliminate cookie consent dialogues and maintain privacy. The fact that no one's implemented it that way and that they still get away with it is an enforcement problem, not a problem with the contours of the regulation. How are we doing for time? I just realized my dumb analog watch has stopped. That's why I thought we had 15 minutes for questions. We are out of time. One more question? One more question. Go. Should we nationalize Starlink now or in 10 years? Look, I got to tell you, I mean, there's uses for like free space wireless telecommunications, including space-based telecoms. I'd be the last person to say otherwise. But like all the satellites that cover a certain footprint are sharing the only electromagnetic spectrum that we have, right? There are, like, you just can't argue with spectrum, right? You can't say, oh, we'll just keep pumping more data through the same amount of space. Like, you know, eventually, like, even if you're successful, which you won't be, like, birds will start catching fire when they fly through it, right? Meanwhile, like, fiber is a thing, and like getting fiber to people's homes is a thing that was solved back in like the 19th century, right? Like the people who pulled electrical wires and phone wires to lonely farmhouses at the end of country lanes were not like practicing a forgotten art. This isn't like embalming pharaohs, right? Like we know how to get wires to places. There's a county, I've just blanked its name. There's a county in Kentucky in Appalachia. It's called the poorest white county in America, because obviously race and income are very highly correlated. But it's a very poor place. And they had a telephone co-op that was a descendant of an electrification co-op from the New Deal that used some state and federal grants to pull fiber to every home, including homes in mountain hollers, which they pulled on the back of a mule called Old Bub. And the median income doubled in this county, right? It became like a place where people, and this was before lockdown. This was before, broadband became so critical to how we operate. And leaving aside the questions of whether like one mercurial, like apartheid Emerald Mine Space Karen should be in charge of our telecoms, it's just not a good system, right? Like fiber, yeah, it's capital intensive, but it also delivers future-proofed internet. And the new infrastructure bill, along with California's fiber bill, really tackle some of the problems we've had with infrastructure maintenance and upgrading with the majority telcos in the years gone by. Under Trump, the incumbent telcos spent $40 billion of public money rolling out copper infra for DSL, right? Like, why weren't they rolling out tin cans and strings? Like, it's just grotesque, right? And the reason is that the existence of fiber makes them look bad, right? They like it. It makes people ask uncomfortable questions about why their internet sucks. I live in Burbank, just down the road. My tax bill every year is about $10,000 for our home. $2,000 of that, 20%, services a bond that was used to install a fiber loop that runs through Burbank. But the franchise agreement with Charter Spectrum, whose CEO was the highest paid CEO in America when the pandemic hit, and who insisted that all of his workers come and work in person, because if you run a telecoms company, you don't believe in telecommuting, apparently. His offices became super spreader sites, and his field personnel were not given any PPE. They were only given hazard pay in the form of coupons to eat at restaurants that had closed during lockdown. Their agreement with my city says that the fiber that runs under my foundation slab can't be terminated in any residentially zoned property. So I have to get my broadband from Charter, but I have to pay 20% of my property tax for the fiber that runs under my house, right? So these problems are not hard problems to come up with solutions for, right? Like, this is not a mystery. What should we do here? The infrastructure bill provides for long-haul fiber. The California bill provides for mid-haul fiber, city limit to city limit. And then it also includes low-cost loans and grants for cities, unincorporated territories, and indigenous reservations to pull fiber to the curb and operate municipal broadband facilities, and to do essential facilities sharing with private firms that want to offer their own. You may remember the early days of DSL before George W. Bush killed the Essential Facilities Order, where we had hundreds of broadband companies in this country because every central office had to allow people to come in and install their own cards in the DSLAM so that you could get DSL from, a big monopoly carrier, or you could get it from a couple of smart people who really wanted to run an ISP in a way that was managed by and for the users. And that was a wonderful time. We could have a regime like that again. Thank you all very much. I'm going to be signing books. Feel free to come up and say hello and ask me more questions. It was lovely to come and chat with you today. I hope you have a great rest of your conference.